My name's Christian Steele, and the story I'm about to read to you can't be read in any library or bought in any shop. This book was given to me on the deathbed of one of my most loyal customers, a man who wrote dark stories from his mind. Could you imagine a place so serene, so quiet? Daniel looked at the palace in the middle of the desert that had appeared before him. In his 17 years on earth, he hadn't seen such a thing of beauty. He knew it wasn't a mirage. He wasn't thirsty. He'd just taken a drink from his flask, and he certainly wasn't starving. He'd ate a bag of crisps not long ago, so he knew it must be real. Daniel just appeared in the desert. In class, he closed his eyes from all those he despised who sat around him. I wish I could be alone, he thought. Now he wasn't alone. Something just didn't feel right, but he felt drawn towards it, and he needed to know what was inside this beautiful place. Daniel ran towards the palace and stopped outside the giant front door. The palace was unguarded. Why would something like this just suddenly appear before him, he thought. He tried the door, and it opened. He walked inside and shut the door behind him. He had never been to a palace before, and a wave of excitement filled him. Then he looked up, and the wave of excitement turned to fear, and his feelings of excitement destroyed. What Daniel saw around him was unspeakable horror and despair. Inside was not the decor of a palace, but the decor of hell, a ruse to trap those struck by wonder before them. The walls were dark, as if they had not been washed for centuries. Daniel ran towards the palace and stopped outside the front door. The palace was unguarded. Why should something like this suddenly appear before him, he thought. He tried the door, and it opened. He walked inside, and the door shut behind him. He'd never been to a palace before, and a wave of excitement hit him. Then he looked up, and a wave of fear destroyed his feelings of excitement. What Daniel saw all around him was unspeakable horror and despair. Inside was not the decor of a palace, but the decor of hell, a ruse to trap those struck by wonder before them. The walls were dark, as if they'd not been washed for centuries. Rotten corpses were strewn all around the hallway, bodies in the middle of decomposition. The smell was unbearable. Paintings adorned the walls of brutal torture and killing. Daniel looked up at the front staircase that was in the center of the hallway, and he heard footsteps walking down it. This was not a man or a woman or even human. Its face was twisted by a hatred of all before it. He reasoned it must be at least 7 foot tall, possibly taller. Daniel shook with fear. This thing, he could not describe what he saw with his own eyes. Paintings were now animated, and pain and anguish could be heard from them. It sets its evil eyes upon him. A shadow was cast over Daniel, and he could feel himself changing from what good he had inside him to a hatred he'd never felt before. It wasn't a hatred of a thing before him, but a hatred of the human race. He felt it must be destroyed, and in his mind he could see what he could do to the world. The thing held its arm out, and the giant door opened. Its twisted mouth screamed a sound unlike anything that had ever been heard before. Daniel was pulled backwards out of the palace and back into the desert. He flew to the spot where he first saw the palace and watched it disappear. Daniel stood up and looked around him. Surely this had not just happened. Who would know? There was no witnesses. Something different now. Something was different now. Something had definitely changed. He put his hands to his face and felt it. He knew something had changed. His face felt twisted and bent out of shape. He felt taller. He felt roughly 7 feet tall. Daniel closed his eyes and wished he was back in class, sat in the middle of the room full of people his own age that looked upon him as some sort of outsider. He knew if he was there, he would exact a vengeance so destructive that it would be felt across the world. A projectile of paper, heavily folded into a triangle, flew across the classroom and just missed Daniel, his attention deeply removed from the noisy room, and after various insults failed to rouse him, a second triangle of paper swung through the air and crashed straight into his brow, lodging into the skin, breaking it before it eventually fell upon the desk. Everyone held their breath while they waited for a response from Daniel, but it didn't come. A teacher entered the room and the noise cooled. Daniel's only movement was to blindly scribble on a piece of paper on the top of his textbook. The cut on his eyebrow spilled, and a large drop of blood dislodged, fell, and landed in the middle of the page, directly in the middle of the palace. It added a dark red to the corpses that lined the palace floor. Daniel tilted his head to the side and smiled as he pushed the blood around the drawing before the teacher started the lesson. He pushed the drawing under his book and feigned some sort of engagement in the lesson. Daniel would normally have cowered when he was the center of attention, but this time things were different. He felt the same glares, but they didn't make him feel small. He felt a new sense of himself as he heard the usual whispers circulating around the class. He imagined the classroom was inside the palace, and his classmates were all lined up with their hands tied behind their backs. The teacher was standing in front of them, talking in a strange, archaic language. This would be their sentencing. And Daniel strode behind the teacher, and in one swoop, he swung an axe straight into the neck and grimaced with anger and delight as the teacher's head smashed cleanly from the body, which slumped to the ground. Screams echoed around the chamber, and Daniel towered over everyone, smiling and posing himself theatrically, as if performing to an unseen audience, with him center stage, swinging the bloodied axe around with consummate ease as he looked along the line, waiting to see who would be next. The end of the lesson commenced, but rather than quickly shove his books into his bag and dashing out of the classroom, Daniel closed his textbook, picked up his bag as people rushed past him. He noticed someone purposely glaring at him as he walked past his desk. He felt an arm swing towards him, so Daniel moved to grab his bag, and the attempted dig completely missed him. The intended punch nearly sent Paul Wallace to the ground, but he regained his balance, only to be met with laughter from the remaining people in the room, making his face turn bright red. Paul mouthed, "You're dead, you little freak." Daniel smiled at him, shook his head, and finished putting his books away in his bag. Daniel's eyes followed Paul as he left the room, and that voice deep within him said, "That's him. He'll be the first." Daniel looked down the corridor, searching for Paul amongst the crowds. He thought he spotted him turning into the bathroom further down the hall. Daniel started to push past the students, feeling a newfound confidence as he grinned at his own intentions. He elbowed and shoved, causing the others to move aside to let him by. He loved this new feeling, like that of a king in his castle, and no one daring to move into his path. The image of the palace of blood flashed through his mind again, with himself seated on a blood-red throne, his clothes dripping with the blood of his enemies, but they were all vanquished and cowering at his feet. Daniel pushed the door into the toilets and saw that only one cubicle was in use. He knew this was the time to use his new power. He paused, listening. He could hear the sounds of Paul shuffling in the toilet, and the noisy din of the students charging up and down the corridor, shrieking and chattering. The noise would disguise his work. He opened his rucksack, looking for a weapon. In the bag was a knife he had used at lunchtime, sharp and sturdy. This is what he would use. He stood before the mirror and lifted the knife to the light, and saw his reflection raising his axe back at him. The reflection grew, turning crimson. The face distorted into a terrible grin. He beheld the monster from the palace, tall and invincible, horrible but vicious. The axe dripped with blood. Daniel felt alive with no fear. This is just the start, he said to himself. He pictured the corridor outside, filled with people. Then he saw the palace walls, and the students were lying dead on the school floor. He saw the desperation in their eyes, their corpses piled along the sides so he could walk through them untouched, a king of the dead and dying. It was exactly what they deserved for not seeing the real him. Daniel gazed at the mirror. The monster's lust for blood, his lust for anguish growing. He must be satisfied. He must cause pain to the innocent lives. It had been that way for centuries. A sudden noise caused Daniel to turn. It was the lock turning in the cubicle. He knew his moment had come. He raised the axe and stood firm, poised like a statue. He pictured his greatness as his foe, Paul Wallace, was finally going to meet his end. The toilet door swung open and Daniel thrust forward and stabbed. The toilet door swung open and Daniel thrust forward and stabbed, right to the throat. He saw the gush of blood and horrible gurgle of his victim sank to his knees before him. Daniel felt glorious as he pulled the knife out and looked at the blade. But then a strange image caught his eye. The blade's reflection showed a slumping body, but it wasn't Paul's. It was Mr. Bradley's, who had taught Daniel when he was much younger. Bradley's eyes looked up at Daniel's in a pleading, uncomprehensive gaze, then closed as his body finally slumped upon the floor. Daniel was shocked. He stood still for a moment, then jumped as a pupil crashed through the bathroom door. The child skidded to a stop, then screamed at the sight before him. He turned and fled the scene, and Daniel heard his footsteps pounding down the corridor. Daniel didn't understand. He was innocent. His bloodlust gone, a feeling of utter anguish and desperation flooded through him. Daniel looked into the mirror. A twisted-faced monster grimaced back at him, laughing.